Good evening and welcome to the school board meeting for District 833. It is Thursday, June 4th, 2020 at 6:30 p.m. The school board meeting is being held through teleconference. Tonight, the school board wishes to recognize the events in our communities following the actions and indifference to human life that led to the death of George Floyd. The students of South Washington County include 30% students of color. And our district has and continues to hear from our Black and brown families about racist incidents both in and outside of our schools. It's a reminder that George Floyd could have been our neighbor, our colleague, or even one of our students. As a board, we want to be clear. It is our responsibility to govern, not just for the few and not just for the loudest voices, but for each and every student placed in our care. And we must do so with racial equity as a guiding principle, because for far too long, our education system has not worked for everyone. As you know, equity is a core value of the school district strategic plan, but we must not only have conversations about race, we must evaluate our policies and remove obstacles that contribute to systematic inequities. We want our students to know, but especially our Black and brown students during this time, that we see you. You are valued and you are not alone. Earlier today, our communities remembered George Floyd at a memorial service in Minneapolis. At this time, we wish to hold a moment of silence. Thank you. The first item on our agenda is roll call. Dana, can you call the roll?
Melinda Doles.
Here.
Louise Hines.
Here.
Simi Petnaik.
Present.
Pat Driscoll.
Here.
Sharon Van Leer.
Present.
Tracy Burnett is absent. Katie Schwartz.
Here. Approval of our agenda. I will entertain a motion to approve.
So moved. This is Sharon.
Second. This is Simi.
And a roll call vote, please.
Melinda Doles.
Yes.
Louise Hines.
Yes.
Simi Petnaik.
Yes.
Pat Driscoll.
Yes.
Sharon Van Leer.
Yes.
Katie Schwartz.
Yes. 4.0 district highlights. This agenda item is scheduled for the June 18th, 2020 meeting. 5.0 is public comment. That agenda item is also scheduled for the June 18th, 2020 meeting. 6.0 is our consent items. All consent items are considered routine and non-controversial by the school board and will be approved by a single motion. There will be no separate discussion of these items. Prior to this meeting, board members have the opportunity to review each of these items and may request that an item be moved to the action items for individual consideration. Since we do not have any requests this evening, I will entertain a motion to approve.
Melinda
Louise
Doles.
Hines, so moved.
And a second.
Pat Driscoll, second. Pat
And
Driscoll.
roll call vote.
Melinda Doles.
Yes.
Louise Hines. Louise Hines.
Yes.
Simi Petnaik.
Yes.
Pat Driscoll.
Yes.
Sharon Van Leer,
Yes.
Katie Schwartz.
Yes.
And I have Melinda as the first motion and Pat as the second.
Correct. Okay, 7.0 are our workshop items. 7.1 is our 2021 fall planning, and that'll be presented by our superintendent, Keith Jacobus.
Thank you. We have two parts to this presentation this evening. The first is to present the findings from focus groups that we convened to start looking at what the fall school year would look like based on the three scenarios that we know the Department of Education, in conjunction with the governor's office, will be contemplating for our start. One would be to begin the school year just as we ended in a distance learning. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in my report about what improvements and what we would be doing differently if we were still to remain teaching remotely. The other is if we started the school year in somewhat of a blended format where we'd have students in a face-to-face setting part of the time and then out of in a virtual or online situation the other part of the time. And then if we started school in a normal fashion with kids coming in face-to-face, but under the social distancing guidelines that we believe still will be in place. So we wanted to start this planning because the summer, as you know, once summer gets here, it's over before you know it. There's a lot to accomplish to be prepared for any one of these scenarios. And we wanted to present, Kelly Jansen worked with the focus groups and John Lindner to use our Qualtrics qualitative analysis software to pull out themes. Kelly will probably talk a little bit about that, but these documents have been out in the public and they are simply suggestions. They're not decisions that have been made. And I say that because some folks have read some of them and decided we were moving forward in certain ways that we haven't even discussed. So we'll go over that first. And then the second part of this, we're fortunate to have Christine Roboleski with us from Teamworks International. And we want to talk about a guiding change document that we want to present tonight as a first reading and a discussion, and then bring it back for approval the next meeting. But Christine will talk to you about, particularly for new board members, how do you use a guiding change document effectively? What do they do for district decision-making? And how do we implement this in a way that helps us look at large decisions and keeps us on the right track? I'll talk a little bit about the history we've been using in the past with guiding change documents, and then we'll discuss and get your input on the guiding change document draft that we have tonight. So first, we'll start with Kelly Jansen, our Director of Teaching and Learning, and she will walk us through the themes that we heard from our focus groups.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Jacobus. Good evening, board members and cabinet. My part of this should be fairly quick. As Dr. Jacobus mentioned, this is already a public document. We have shared it with many internal and external stakeholders. In the board agenda, there is a PDF that is the focus group summary, which is right here. And we did conduct a little bit more than 80 focus groups with staff, students, parents, and community members. When we received after we received the data from the focus groups, our team sat down and started to analyze the data and look at some themes. And from that, we were able to generate 5 categories of thoughts or processes that the general comments fit into. Health and safety, mental health and social emotional well-being, learning experience, teaching and learning practices, and adult learning and professional development. Couple notes on some of those. The learning experience, I think since handing this over to Dr. Jacobus and the assistant superintendents, that has evolved to become a broader category around logistics and scheduling types of activities. And I just want to make a note about, we were really purposeful on the adult learning and professional development, keeping those separate, knowing that adult learning could include some technical things around health and safety that we would need to know that you may not consider part of professional development. And also knowing there is going to be some need for some learning within our community and with our parents in order for them to understand kind of why we're making some of the decisions that we're making. And then, of course, that professional development piece, how can we be prepared? Our teachers did an amazing job stepping up in the 8 days that we had to prepare for distance learning. Knowing we have a little bit more time, how can we provide professional development so that in the event in the fall we are in some form of online teaching, we can evolve to be more of true online teachers versus just that distance learning. And there certainly is a difference, and I know that we'll be having those conversations with you throughout the summer, but just a little bit more specificity to some of those groups. When you look at the results, or if you look at this document, so each category then is separated into a couple different sections. If there were comments that had the potential to apply to any of the scenarios that Dr. Jacobus mentioned, they were put directly underneath the category. And then if within that category, there were comments that applied specifically to one of the scenarios, whether it was full distance learning, face-to-face with parameters from the Department of Health and Department of Ed, or a hybrid of being some online and some face-to-face. So that is how the comments are structured. And I don't plan on going through them all. This is posted for folks to see, but I would encourage people, as you read it, as Dr. Jacobus mentioned, there was some angst around some of the comments that there isn't a lot of explanation when you look through them. And so take them for what they are, and it is a summary. Again, there was more than 80 focus groups, so 80 hours of people discussing all three scenarios. And when we upload that text analysis into Qualtrics, it generates some things for us, but there was also some human thought that went into some separating. So we did our best to consolidate thought, and there was definitely no intention of predetermined decisions. This will be a guiding document for groups to have additional conversation, but these in no way suggest that this is what is happening in the fall. So with again, the health and safety category, mental health and social emotional well-being, and you notice they don't have any comments that are separated by the scenario, knowing that all those comments would cross any of the scenarios. And learning experience, which has now turned into logistics. It'll have a lot to do with scheduling and transportation and things that go along with that. And teaching and learning practices. So how are we going to take advantage of this opportunity to reimagine how we teach and learn within our schools? In change theory, one of the biggest things is a catalyst for change, and a pandemic and shutting down the schools is a pretty big catalyst for change. So we're hopeful that we can use this as an opportunity to evolve our teaching and learning practices. And then the last category, again, is that adult learning and professional development. So that is a real quick summary of what you can see when you look through those. And I would take any questions.
Hey, Kelly, this is Simi. How many of the 80 plus focus groups, how many people are represented by those 80 plus focus groups?
Like actual number of people?
Yeah, just a rough estimate would be helpful.
Our largest teacher group was, I think, around 85 people. And our smallest teacher group was around 15. So, and I believe they comprised over half of the focus groups. So
the teachers did, okay.
Teachers did, yeah.
Okay.
And then the parent advisories were all between probably 10 and 20. And then our student advisories, for example, in the elementary, for example, they did go into a classroom. So it was 20 to 25 students. So I can get you exactly, I think, if you would like, but that's kind of a summary of the group makeups, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's helpful. Do you know how representative those groups are of our district in general? And then also, did we have any focus on, for example, students or families that really struggled with distance learning or really did well with distance learning so that we could see how we could apply those lessons?
We did. Corey Thompson, I think she's on. She did some within her department. So Achievement and Integration had a few focus groups, or at least a focus group in which she did. And I don't know if you want to add to that, Corey.
No, everything you said was correct. So we did the A&I advisory group, and so we had an opportunity to talk to a variety of different parents within A&I that dealt with our marginalized students. So it also was about color, but then they also had students that were SPED students, and so we were able to see those two together.
And also our student groups, our assistant principals did a fabulous job of making sure it was a diverse representative and students who were successful and students who struggled. So we were intentional regarding that.
I think it should be noted that these are not all of the ideas that could ever be generated. It is a jumping off point for the work that we're going to do in depth over the summer. And again, there were many, many more comments. The software pulls out the themes. So as you see from all of the groups, there's a shortened list. And again, they're not decisions. So that's really important for the public, that these are brainstorming ideas to give us things to think about. And as we delve deeper in, there'll probably be more things that come to light when the work is done to get ready to plan in each one of these areas.
Yeah, and I would add that they will live in the Qualtrics software, and there's a lot of tools within that software that we're going to be able to employ once we start having specific conversations around each theme. So,
Kelly, this is Louise. I'm not sure if it's a you question or someone else. For someone who wants to take a close look at that document, what is the easiest pathway to get to where it's posted?
Right now, it's within the board agenda. 7.1, I certainly, I think we could look at having it in a different spot on the website that might be, maybe it's within the distance learning, or I can work with Pepe and his team on that. But right now, this is a PDF link within tonight's agenda, and we will see where it can live in a better spot.
Thank you.
Okay. Then we wanted to move on now to the guiding change document. And Teamworks International has been working with the district for a number of years, long before I got here, and this is my 8th year, completing my 8th year. But the first year that I was superintendent, Dennis Cheesebrough came in and talked to us about a number of things to train us together and how we work as a board and a superintendent. But one of the things that he presented at that time, and it might have been a review, but we really started to look at it closely, was the use of a guiding change document. That was 2012, I believe. And the first time we implemented it was the very next year. We were into our long-term facilities planning process, the last one before this one we had just tabled. And we put together a guiding change document. That was the first one we used. And ever since then, we have used a guiding change document for all of our large decision-making processes. So you as a board have the ability to guide the process and make sure that when we bring recommendations for you to approve, that we have heard things that are unacceptable, and it's the guidelines, and we talk about them as a guardrails on our work. So as we come back, we know that we have met your needs along with the district's needs. And so we've used them for boundary decisions, for budget reductions, for levy decisions as we've gone through, and for our long-term facilities planning process. So tonight we have a draft, and for those of you that are new and haven't been through this with as a board member, we bring a draft and discuss it, and we go through and we gather all of your input on what you would suggest as we refine it. We take it back and try to fit things in. There are some things that come forward that really don't belong in the guiding change. We'll talk about that, or as we go through, we may find that there's areas that already cover that. But then we bring that back for a final approval, and this will be our guiding change or our guiding documents to our work. So we're fortunate, as I said, to have Christine Roboleski from Teamworks International here tonight, and she's going to talk to us about how these documents are utilized and implemented in the best way to make decision-making transparent, to give you as a board a strong a voice in guiding these large decisions. Christine's also a parent in our district, so she knows our district well and has worked with us. She does a lot of work with superintendents and districts around the country and world. And thank you so much, Christine, for being here tonight. And I'll turn it over to you to talk about guiding change in general.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacobus, and good evening, Vice Chair Schwartz, members of the board, and the rest of the cabinet members and public who are listening in tonight. Pepe, if you could show the few number of slides that I have offered for tonight's guiding change documents. And I can talk you through this, and we can go right to slide 2. So thank you so much. What I wanted to do is just remind you of the session that you as board members had with Dennis Cheeseborough back in January. It seems like a whole different world back in January compared to the way it is right now. But if you look at this first slide here, it's a good reminder of the education leadership system that he reviewed with you back then, and the roles of governance, management, and consultation. And a reminder that when he was working with you and the guiding change document, the frameworks that we at Teamworks are all about helping us stay in our roles so that we can move forward in partnership together. And by understanding our roles and staying in those roles through use of process and frameworks, it allows us to do our work more effectively and more productively. So this is just a reminder, bringing you back to that time back in January when you were working with Dennis. And then if we move to the next slide, Pepe, we will start discussing the guiding change document a little bit more in depth. So the practices for those who govern and manage, I think you recall that we at Teamworks like to call it excellence in management and governance. There are 4 practices that we recommend that boards and your superintendents and your management teams use in order to be in partnership with each other. One is the leadership choices framework, which I will not go over tonight, but there are 2 that relate to the guiding change document. One is differentiating between the roles of governance and management, and that is partnership practice number 2 that we go over with when we are working with school boards and administrative teams on their partnership leadership development. The third is about the informal consultation to the superintendent with statements of consultation. I believe Dennis may have covered that back in January. But tonight, we're really going to spend more time talking about the formal consultation to the superintendent through the guiding change framework. And Pepe, if you go to the next slide, I will just go over this. Partnership practice number 2, again, is allowing you to stay in your roles, whether it's governance or management, and ask yourself, what are the key questions that any situation is presenting you with? The example from tonight is planning for the fall, understanding that you have COVID-19, this pandemic that has changed education for everyone across the country. And we have had school districts, our partner school districts, ask us, how can we use the frameworks to help guide our planning moving forward, with your district being one of them. And one of the things that we have reminded many of our school boards and school board chairs about is, if you're stuck in any way, a great thing to do is to start asking yourself, what are the key governance questions that you're presented with, and what are the key management questions, so that you can each do your best staying in your role. So the governance questions that you would want to be asking for yourself if you're a board member is, why, to what end, and through what policies to kind of stay in those authorities of governance. And that assists the board in working together and having one collective voice. And then the management questions that you can certainly be thinking about as a board, but that the management team is responsible for implementing, are what, when, and how, and then who's responsible for doing it. So it allows you to have a really good partnership, and that's what the administrative team here is suggesting for you. Pepe, if you move to the next slide, is to use partnership practice number 4, which is consultation through the guiding change framework. And I'll explain the guiding change framework again to you. I believe Dennis went over it in January, but it really is a way in the sense of boards and the administrative team working together to have that consultation so that, as Dr. Jacobus mentioned, you have the opportunity to set the parameters for an issue or a change process, and it allows the administrative team to determine the how. And so the guiding change document, really, if you look at the image there on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that it allows you to set parameters through the unacceptable means, through outlining the current context and reality, answering the question of why are we even going through some kind of change process? Why do we need to do anything differently? In this case, you have the pandemic and you need to plan differently for the fall than you ever have before. You also outline what are the results that you're seeking to achieve, not how are you hoping to achieve it, because you want to give whichever group is responsible for developing the plan or the options for you to have a lot of space to develop those creative, acceptable means. So you develop and outline the why, which is the context and reality. You outline what you would like to see accomplished. You also outline the unacceptable means, which is what are you not going to allow or entertain in order to move from the current context and reality to those desired results, so that you give a team that's not in the room, but you in the role of leadership have an opportunity to shape and set those parameters for change. The same, you can use a guiding change document if you're the superintendent and you want your cabinet to be able to implement and develop plans. And the same thing for your school principals and your teacher teams. Even students can use this guiding change document when they're doing some cooperative work. Again, it allows you to set some parameters for change to come without you needing to be involved in how you get there. And it allows people to stay in their individual roles. So since this document, and you saw the draft that the superintendent, I think, is going to present when I'm done giving you this overview, it really allows you to provide limitations on how to achieve those desired results, but it also gives, again, your team that's implementing and developing the planning to have a lot of space to give you different options. As Dr. Jacobus mentioned, if this is a partnership document between the administration and the board, then it's generally prepared by the administration initially in draft format. The board reviews and refines it, and then sends it back to the administrative team for implementation and further development. Guiding change documents are generally not set in stone. They tend to be somewhat flexible, but they can be used during a significant design process. I think Dr. Jacobus mentioned boundary changes are often used. The guiding change document is a first step when you're doing any kind of design process or large scale change process. And it allows you to go back to really answer the question of why are we doing this and what are we hoping to accomplish? Because every plan requires adjustment, but it really keeps your planning team focused on the same results and having a same understanding about why you're moving forward. And in addition, what is often neglected when you're moving forward with planning are those unacceptable means. What are we simply not going to entertain in getting to those desired results? It also allows you to reflect on those questions that I just mentioned, the governance and the management questions that allow you to stay within your roles and stay focused on what you as a board need to do. Sometimes when these guiding change documents are developed, some questions about current policies are raised, and it goes back on the board's agenda to consider any policies that need to change as a result of a new plan. I don't know if you've faced any of that right now with COVID-19 or distance learning, but you may have had to have some exceptions to those. And if you move to the next slide, Pepe. Oh, I think we are done. So that's generally an overview of the guiding change framework and process. Again, it allows you to be in partnership with the superintendent, using those two practices together. Practice number 2, which is differentiating between the governance and management questions, and then having this consultation with the guiding change framework is very helpful to school boards that we've worked with for decades now. And you can use a guiding change document between the board and the administrative team for things like the budgeting process. We have some school boards that will set 3 to 5 guiding change documents at the start of the school year for major issues that are going to be affecting the school district. And again, it allows that partnership to evolve, and it allows the board to set the parameters for the change while giving the administrative team an opportunity to lay out some of that context and reality and meet the expectations of the board. Dr. Jacobus?
Thank you. And I'm hoping that you'll stay for the discussion.
Absolutely.
Because one of the issues when we started using the guiding changes, we were trying to refine things that we might have put in here because they were philosophical feelings and things that didn't quite fit. And at that time, then we'd call the next day and talk to Dennis Cheesebrough and say, hey, what about this? And he would clarify, that doesn't really fit in the way you're thinking it. And then we got better at it. So I want you to know that if this is the first time you're going through this, that Christine can kind of keep us, maybe answer questions if there's something that comes up and we're explaining and it doesn't quite fit the way you're thinking. So as was mentioned, there's 3 areas that we drafted our current reality. And this is a fairly lengthy guiding change document because there's 3 different scenarios that we want this guiding change document to guide us in and to oversee. So we're not building one for each of the 3 possible contingencies. It needs to be a document that with planning, whatever the Department of Ed and the governor's office decides, this will guide us. So the current reality, certainly as was mentioned, and I don't know, Pepe, will you pull this up on the screen? There you go. All right. As was mentioned, the current reality is we closed since March 30th because of the pandemic, which is the main reality that brings this document forward. So as you see at the beginning, it states about closing after the 30th. Another area, for many teachers, this was the first time curriculum was delivered through mostly a digital platform. And that's when Kelly had mentioned the difference between online learning and distance learning. We used a blended pattern where for some assignments and some kids at some grade levels, we sent things home in a paper format. We used different platforms like Seesaw and for our younger learners. And then we used WebEx, Zoom, and that for our older learners. But it was an amazing feat for people to change really their entire career in 8 days and start to move forward. And we know that I won't jump ahead on things. So the building closures have placed burdens on children and family and have disproportionately, impacted communities of color as well as Indigenous, immigrant, non-English speaking families, special education families, and our low-income families. It also has impacted kids that may not fit in our groups or that we have listed here. Trying to do this on your own creates a challenge for isolation and for parents too, all of our parents, if they were at home working from home and helping their kids or helping to guide them or even motivating them. We have a 2021 calendar that was already approved as a current reality, and you'll see that'll show up later on the results section on why that's in the current reality. Parents and students were surveyed 3 times during the distance learning period in 2020 to evaluate time spent on distance learning, technology issues, or concerns and district performance. After that May 1st and 4th planning, then we adjusted based on the survey and what we knew was working well to try to enhance that and what issues we were having to try to change and improve. Educators developed and facilitated over 200 hours of professional development between March 18th and March 15th, with little time to prepare for again, implementing that. The professional development topics included technology basics, online teaching support, social and emotional learning, trauma-informed practices, support for Seesaw, Schoology, culturally linguistic and responsive learning, and a range of special education topics and literacy support. Staff development was also provided and updated for paraprofessionals and included special education support and cultural climate. So again, setting the stage, our reality was we did a lot of professional development to implement. Emergency childcare is provided for Tier 1 and Tier 2, or provided for Tier 1 and Tier 2 and high needs families. Again, the tiers for the public, those are intervention strategies that we have in the district, so we have some acronyms in here. Distance learning was available to children enrolled in preschool and parents enrolled in early childhood. Community education, Kids Club staff manage the state mandated emergency care programs for essential workers and free and reduced qualified families. Nutrition services served over 155,000 meals to students in the community between the 18th and the 31st of May. Over 3,000 devices were distributed to K-12 students upon indicating that there was no access to a device at home. We also issued hotspots, 234 of those hotspots for people without internet connections. The Minnesota Department of Education asked school districts to develop an educational model that balanced in-school and distance learning methods in the case that a typical in-building school year is not possible, or they're asking us if it's not possible for the 2021 school year. MDE has asked that all Minnesota school districts prepare a plan for the transition back to school in the fall. Over 80 focus groups, as you heard earlier, were conducted in our district to talk to stakeholders, students, families, and staff to outline considerations for the return. We wanted to capitalize on what we knew worked well and address issues that did not meet our needs and our expectations. And the district adjusted the grading scale, as you know, to address the changes that happened during this last trimester. So there's probably some other, and we can, once we go through this, give you a chance if there's reality question or considerations that we wanted to highlight. And I'm just going to jump to the results first before we go to the unacceptable means, because I think that has a conversation that will take a little time as well. But what we think of as the results is these are our terms of satisfaction. If we do things well and to your satisfaction and follow the unacceptable means in this document, these are the results that we'll have through the planning that we can implement. Our results need to be aligned with our strategic plan and our core values, and that'll drive our direction and path moving forward. And I would highlight, which is so evident now in the spring and some of the things that are happening, that our equity work is really our core and our foundation of the work that we need to continue to move forward and make some strides in next year. Safety of our students and families and staff in our community is our top priority. Building relationships and getting to know students will be the foundation of learning. We know that was much harder in some ways, and it was enhanced because of the extra effort as well. So there's a mixture of relationship. We want to engage our students in instruction that is consistent with learning expectations prior to the COVID-19 closure. One of the things that we do not plan to do in the fall is similar things to this spring that had us looking at the amount of content that we taught differently, the rigor differently, our ability to test differently, our ability to really manage the integrity of the work. All of those areas need to be addressed. So what we do next year is mirroring what we would have done in the classroom, whether it's done in a virtual environment or a blended learning or a socially distanced face-to-face. And our plan will provide flexibility for students, staff, and families for the delivery of curriculum should a student or family member become ill. We have that issue both with our staff and kids. How do we address that? K-12 students across the entire district will have access to flexible delivery of services and a personal device that will be issued and used both in school and at home. We want to capitalize on the students that did very well in this environment. We had kids that did better in this environment for a number of reasons. And then we also want to make sure the kids that did not flourish in this type of environment, that we have the ability, if we can't have any face-to-face, that we're improving what we're doing, moving toward that online, basically for secondary kids, but in ways that we mitigate the problems that kids had, so we're not facing the same challenges and kids are not facing the same challenges. Also, if we return to school in a normal setting other than the social distancing, we want to give our kids a chance to still use an online or a virtual learning environment if it works better for them. We also want to utilize or work with our teachers who do wonderful things online and have this blended system. For our teachers that do much better and we're not as familiar and the face-to-face is the power of their instruction and kids being in class is a much better situation. We want to utilize that too. So we anticipate if we learn from what happened this spring, that even if we're able to return to everybody coming to school using distance learning, we don't want to go back into the exact mode that we were in. So this flexibility is important. Our plan also will include providing high quality childcare, and will cover facility space, staff, and health and safety resources. We'll provide early learning, our birth to age 5 opportunities in early childhood and family education, preschool, and early childhood special education and school readiness programs. This requires appropriate facilities and staffing to ensure age-appropriate learning, regardless of the delivery model. We want to be responsive to learning with a wide range of special education topics and literacy support. We know that our special needs kids, for a lot of them, this was very difficult because the support that we offer can't happen in the same way without a person available. And so we need to make some changes if we're unable to do the face-to-face. Staff development was also provided. I'm sorry, I'm jumping to back into the reality. The grading, we want to look at the grading, is provided in a way that provides students and parents feedback that measures student performance against a fixed set of learning standards as determined by the teacher. And again, the grading, what we did with transcripts and grading trimester was for this trimester. We will not be carrying that forward in the fall. We are committed to teaching and learning and ensuring a safe and exclusive environment, whether it's virtually or face-to-face, that encourages diverse perspective, and it excites engagement, innovation, creativity, resulting in the empowerment and motivation to create shared ownership and learning. We know that part of the improvement is pulling kids in. It was hard for kids if they were doing well and they could get things done quickly, for them to stay engaged and to look further. It was difficult for kids who were struggling to stay motivated and engaged. So we want to address those and improve. We want to use the opportunity as a catalyst to reimagine teaching, I should say, and learning as we know it, as I said, by dismantling the systematic racism to address opportunity gaps, reimagining when and where learning takes place. For students, we want to support an environment that cultivates voice and choice in education and makes education accessible to each student. And I would say that we learned a lot about working from home, which our system has never had for any adult in the system. And we want to continue with that for folks that, say in finance and different areas, where when they're able to work from home, that we still allow that to happen. Along with our teachers, we had looked at our teacher work days this year and said that teachers could work from any environment they wanted as long as they got the work done. That is something we haven't ever really discussed in the past. This forced us to take a look, and we found some very positive things. Classes that need to be in person, like Project Lead the Way, our CTE classes, and we've had requests for music and things like that. If that's possible, we want to look at how do we blend that. A cross-section of stakeholders will have been consulted to inform the decision-making, which I'll talk to you about in my report. Flexibility for parents and students. The transportation outcome, we have to look at whatever the scheduling looks at, like that's going to impact transportation and impact ability to do some of the things that we want to do. So that has to be considered. Extracurricular activities and out of school time, how do we address that? It was really hard with the isolation and not being able to be out. We were trying to encourage kids to get out and play and have some organized activity, along with the community ed programs, and then we didn't have a spring season with athletics. So we want to keep the well-being of our kids and families with activity as well, and then flexibility with our school calendar. Part of that has to do with the kids that learn and want to do their work and are better at 9 o'clock at night till 2 in the morning. We like to give that opportunity for teachers the same way that learning does not have to happen just between the regular school hours. And we saw that work well in many instances this spring. So those are the results we're looking at. And I want to stop there then and have you digest that a bit. I know that was a lot and a lot of reading that you can read for yourself, but we want to give you the opportunity to weigh in on results that you might be thinking of that we don't have in here, and any suggestions for things you think about that you see from your perspective as parents and board members that you'd like us to consider, that if we reach all of these outcomes, that we've made sure we address the positives and address the challenges and change that.
And Dr. Jacobus, this is Christine Robleski.
Yep.
One of the easy kind of traps to fall into as we're doing guiding change documents is to be tempted in the results to put in some of the hows. And so that is one of the temptations I would suggest that board members resist, is to try and put in how are we going to accomplish the results, but rather really focus, if you're going to be talking and outlining the results you'd like to see, is what are the results in the end that you're hoping to achieve, such as that flexibility for your students. And so being careful to really distinguish those governance versus management questions, the what versus the how, and then the context and reality column. Again, that's about painting the picture for why are we even moving forward with this change at this point. And it's generally a combination of numbers like you've shown there, and the context for what's happening with the stakeholders and the people in the district, including some of the challenges that you've outlined with some students doing well with distance learning and others perhaps not doing so well. So I just wanted to remind you about that temptation that we fall into, all of us, when we're doing the guiding change document, and try to avoid outlining the how as part of the guiding change document, but rather the what and the results. And then I know once you have some questions from board members, and I'm happy to assist with answering those, we can talk about the unacceptable means as well.
Great point.
Does anybody have any questions on the what, the why, or comments?
I had a question. This is Simi, and this is more of a logistical question. So for the guiding change document, what sort of feedback have we typically taken from the community once this has been developed, and how do we, if we do take that feedback, how do we take it? And I'm talking like, students or parents, teachers, whoever else, other stakeholders, other community members in the process.
Well, I'll let Christine jump in, but this is our document to guide us as administrators in our work. It's really not a public document to say, hey, what would you like to see? The focus groups are, and when we look at the process of how we get there, that's when their voice can come in. But this is really an internal work document, and so we haven't taken these out. Now, if we had a facilities planning process, there might have been some discussions that the document was developed that way. This was developed through us internally from feedback and what we were seeing over the spring. Would that be a fair way to describe that, Christine?
Yes, it's really a tool or a framework for leadership in order, again, to set parameters for a process or a change. So as you noticed in the desired results that I believe your administrative team put in, a desired result would be to have representation from your stakeholders, broad representative representation from your stakeholders as one of the results. So in terms of stakeholder voice, sometimes that voice can be represented as part of the context and reality, frankly, including with some districts that historically there hasn't been a significant representative stakeholder voice. We will see districts place that as sometimes as the context and reality in order to get to a desired result, that there is more broad representation. and more intentional engagement with stakeholders. So this is really a tool for the board and the administrative team to shape the parameters, and then how you get there is determined through that planning process. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else on the what or the why?
It's Louise, not a question so much as a comment. I am happy to see that, distance learning was nobody's first choice right now, but I'm happy to see that there is specifically going to be a space to look at who succeeded here, or what do we take from this that changes education no matter what its shape is in the future.
Good. And I would leave this as we go before we come to the next board meeting. If you're looking at that and you see something, you have questions, you can always let me know. But now going on to the unacceptable means. Now this is, as you see, it's a shorter column, and that the goal is to have as few items as necessary in the unacceptable means for us to do the work and bring back the product that is acceptable. If the unacceptable means gets so long, it becomes prescriptive, and as Christine mentioned, it blocks out that creative and a creative work to get to our ends. So what we have listed right now for unacceptable, that we will not engage in actions or behaviors that are in conflict with the strategic plan and district values, that our comprehensive COVID-19 fall plan will not violate school district policies or laws. There was a question about employee contracts. All of that is governed by law, but that was a question that came forward as we went through. We will not exacerbate existing opportunity gaps through our decisions. That certainly is something that we want to pay attention to as we get into next year. We will not blame or hold accountable students and families for challenging personal circumstances or limited resources. This may include time resources, family circumstances, technology, etc. And again, this isn't that this is consciously done. It's a systematic thing that can happen. So we'll really watch for that. We will not allow voices of a few to influence the decision that apply and represent to all of our diverse students, families, staff, and community. Certainly, as you know, this was a challenge, and I think there were a lot of emotions on the fear of the pandemic, and this was schooling and the challenging, and there's a lot of strong opinions on what the hopes and dreams are for us as a system from parents and that, and we have to guide it through what we know as the educational experts and how we can improve, listening them through the process. So those are what we identified, and I would open it up for discussions, and Christine can help guide us and what would be fitting for unacceptable means, or if we drifted a bit.
Right. And Dr. Jacobus, I would reiterate, keeping the list shorter is generally better. You had mentioned, will not violate school district policies or laws or perhaps employee contracts. We know, working with a number of districts right now, that memorandums of understanding are being crafted right now, understanding that some of those contracts, simply by virtue of the current circumstances, cannot be met. But sometimes when you're going through this process, it will bring to the forefront policies that no longer fit with the results that you're trying to achieve. And through that, you can certainly bring those policies forward in order to change them. So that's the other positive aspect of using a guiding change document, is you're not held to maintain a policy that no longer works for the district or the board, but you can certainly highlight that for the possibility of making change moving forward.
Anyone have any questions, comments, concerns on the not how?
I don't know where this is Simi. I don't know where this would fit, but one of the concerns I have heard from a few people is that, this past trimester, we had fewer days of learning. And I've had a few parents reach out and be concerned about the gaps in their children's knowledge as their children head back to school in September, and how we would both address the what they have missed by the shorter school year? And then also, how far behind are they going to be in September compared to, a year ago September? But then also, if we do end up going to a distance or hybrid or whatever model, how do we ensure that students both learn what they've missed and then also keep on track curricularly, if that's a word? So I don't know which of these, whether that gets into the what or the not how, but I think it's important to acknowledge that we would expect, like, to state very bluntly that we would expect students to complete, an actual year's worth of work as expected, state standards and all that stuff.
Yep, and I think in there, that's one of the things that we had talked or said that we know that we want to make this, if we're in a distance learning, that trimester in the fall has to mimic as closely as possible what it would have looked like if they were in class. I'm trying to find the bullet here.
Right, I thought I heard it, but then I couldn't find it quickly when I was looking for it.
I think it's on the second page. It's use this opportunity as a catalyst to reimagine teaching and learning as we know it by dismantling racism to address opportunity gaps, reimagining when and where learning takes place. It could be part of that bullet. It's not as explicit as what you're saying in terms of the learning gap and trying to have the plan include addressing those gaps so that students don't fall farther behind when they're doing distance or online learning.
Simi
and Louise, this is Julie Nielsen. I just wanted to bring to your attention bullet point number 4 that says engage students in instruction that is consistent with learning expectations prior to COVID-19.
Okay.
You wanted to say something about taking into consideration the gap, that can certainly be added.
Oh, yeah, on the results. Good point, Julie.
Thank you. I totally read over that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julie.
But it's a good point because part of the summer programming is trying to really assess where kids are and trying to move them forward. And I think it's important, as everyone knows, the loss of days were not our decision. It was how we had the planning, which again for Minnesota was really amazingly helpful compared to other states that turned this around in 24 hours. I'm not sure how they could have done it. But that's a good point on the Concerned Parents app, as I've been contacted by parents too to make sure, well, what are we going to do? And I think part of hopefully at the end of the year, as teachers connected with parents, they can assure them here's the successes and what we can do in the summer to be prepared in the fall.
And then one other thing I think would be helpful is just, and I think this may go in the what, but goes into some sort of communication focused bullet that I think one piece of feedback I have gotten pretty consistently lately is that I think when we explain out what our parameters are or what our procedures are going to be, that people feel like they have had adequate notice of them and that they understand them. And so having something in there so that people feel like there is very clear communication about what schooling is going to look like, what that's going to mean in terms of, daily schedules or grading or, lunch or whatever it is very clearly delineated so that parents and students, families in general, feel like they are, that they have the information they need to make the decisions that they need to make. And I don't know, I think that probably would go under results.
Yes, it definitely would. And I can work with Julie Nielsen on that as well if you would like some assistance, but that is definitely something that would fall under a desired result, is that families have the information they need to move forward with their own family decision making and educating their children.
Mm-hmm.
This is Melinda. I just want to piggyback on what Simi said, and I completely agree with that it's good to not, blindside these families and let them know ahead of time, what type of things are going to be changing so we don't have another situation like we did this trimester. And Christine was talking about how we're able to change our policies for what type of learning we're doing at that point. And I just think that would be a really good idea on our district's part to have some type of policy for whatever method that we choose we're going to be doing in the fall. And then once we, can go back to traditional face-to-face, if that's not what we're doing in the fall, we could always go back and revise that policy again. But I think it's really good to have things that are really precise to what we're doing so we don't end up in any more of these situations. And so our expectations are really clear. Thank you.
The issue that we're not going to be able to control, what happened this spring was because of when the state let us know things. So we were going to be a little bit bound by, if the state gives us things early, which they'll give us the plan early, although I think it's a little late. They said by the end of July, they'll have this out. We have all our plans done by the end of July, so whichever one they choose, then we can refine in August. And people will be waiting. They're going to be asking tomorrow, what's happening, and rightfully so. But some of this, as was mentioned, this document is flexible. It is not written in stone, and I think that's important because it's an internal document. When you mentioned, Simi, about the public, when we've gone through this in the past, and people looked at the guiding changes and said, well, wait, you didn't quite follow this. Well, part of this is not meant to be set in stone because as we get into the house and get moving into it, and the state may change things, there may be things we have to adjust as we go through. So I think the communication is really important, especially this is such a big deal about what's fall going to look like. As soon as we know, we want to get that out. So.
And Dr. Jacobus, you took the words out of my mouth, which is this is a document that you will approve, hopefully, and have in partnership. But you may find that you need to make some adjustments to the document based on what you hear back from the state or on circumstances changing with the pandemic and COVID-19 itself. We certainly were thrown for a loop this spring when everything changed on us. And I've never seen such a quick turnaround. I know the system hasn't worked for many students, but it was something to see every school district be able to make an adjustment and reach most of the students that they serve, and really try to get that engagement, even if it meant home visits in the time of a pandemic. So as a parent, I want to applaud you for doing that, and I understand that not all students excelled in this environment, as Dr. Jacobus said, but some really did. And the districts that have sort of doubled down on using the frameworks, it allowed them to stay focused and to remind themselves of exactly what are we hoping to achieve here and how do we take the opportunities from this challenging time in order to move forward and use the challenges to move us forward. And you have that in your results as well, which is being creative and being able to move forward regardless of what kind of education you're going to be providing, whether it's in person, a combination, or all distance learning. It sounds like you all are already working in partnership by having this guiding change document conversation.
Does anyone else have anything to add?
It's Pat Driscoll. I have a question for Julie. Could we change or add to that second bullet, make progress or works towards closing the achievement gap as a result?
Pat, are you checking the second one, safety of our staff, or the third one?
No, the one that she mentioned when she was talking with Simi about, where it was addressed.
Oh, the COVID-19, that fourth one, yep, engaging students in instruction that is consistent with learning expectations prior to COVID-19.
Yes,
that one.
And works towards closing the achievement gap.
Yep, and Pat, I changed the wording already on the master document. I just put, while taking into consideration the gaps that may have been created. So I hope I captured that.
I think I want to see more than that, not just, holding the same. I want to see progress towards closing the achievement gap while we're doing this, because it is an opportunity for us to do something a little different, so that perhaps we can find a way to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Okay, then, well, we'll take those suggestions. We'll bring this back in 2 weeks. If there's things that you think about, certainly give me a call, and we'll have it back in the meeting on the 18th. And thank you so much, Christine, for being here and helping us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all of you for guiding our students, including my very own.
Thank you. And on to 8.0 information items, and 8.1 is our community education budget presented by Bob Lawrence, our Director of Community Education.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to share the community education budget. The theme of the night, I guess, is challenges that we face, and creating this budget was no exception. So I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation. So typically, when we start the budget process back in February, I don't think that share did it.
It was there for a minute.
There we go. Play from the beginning. Okay. So typically when we started start the process, we start in February and start looking ahead to what we think the trends are going to be and some assumptions that we have based on enrollment or program growth. And we did do that in February, but as with everything else, everything changed in March with the distance learning and the closure of school buildings and programming associated with that. So I'll talk about that tonight. This is a very different budget. Typically, when I present the budget, you would see a lot of bar graphs and information about enrollment trends or program growth or changes or fee structures. But really, this one is what I've talked to staff about. It's really a bare bones budget. And what do we know? What can we assume? And where are we going to be over the course of the next 12 months with the fact that most of our programming is fee-based, and we've seen some drastic changes in that. So I'll talk through that tonight through this process. Here's an overview of where we are and where we anticipate we will be. So the first column on the left, you'll see, is what we had originally budgeted for the year we're just ending now. We had originally budgeted just shy of $16 million in revenue, over $15.5 million in expenses, and seeing a positive net result to add to our fund balance to bring it up to that board policy of 5 to 9%. The reality, the middle section, was a revised budget we did in April after the closure and cancellation of many programs. So you can see we did drop over $3.5 million in our expected revenues. And also because of a lot of fixed costs and the governor's executive order in providing services such as emergency care, our expenditures went down, but not as much as our revenue projection went down, resulting in a deficit or a loss of $588,000 is anticipated. Our beginning fund balance was just over $500,000, $515,839. So it will result in a deficit fund balance. However, as Dan shared at the last meeting, and he'll talk about, I believe, in his budget presentation, the general fund may and contribute to the losses in the community service fund, and a number of the expenses that were incurred had to do with emergency childcare and community ed staff who really stepped in to provide the structure and the staffing for that. And so there will be a transfer made, but it's not indicated here. Dan's slide will look a little bit differently, and at the next meeting when it comes back for approval, you'll see that number in there. So our proposed budget looking ahead to 2020-2021 school year is quite a bit smaller than what it would have been in a typical school year. We're anticipating just over $10.5 million in revenue, around $10.5 million in expenses. So you can see we're at about 60% of what we would have if you compare it to the original budget for the current school year. Fortunately, we are projecting a balanced budget, so we do anticipate just shy of $100,000 in revenue over expenses. I right now, for planning purposes, have a 0 fund balance, but that is actually going to be a little bit above 0 depending on what that final transfer is. But even if it was 0, we would still end up with a 1% fund balance. That's not where we want to be, and certainly not where we anticipated, but I don't think anybody is where they anticipated they would be right now. So that's a quick overview, and now I'll talk through how we came to these assumptions. This is just a slide to share just the breadth of community education of the services that we offer. Everything from early learning through youth programming, out of school time, adult programs. We also manage facility use and outside group rentals for school buildings and have our aquatics program. Often people are familiar with the 1, 2, or 3 programs that they or their family participate in, but this slide is to show the $15 million budget is spread out over a number of different programs, attempting to serve all 98,000 residents of our school district of all ages and residents of all ages. The specific impact of COVID-19. Our Kids Club program, which is our largest revenue source or largest revenue program, was closed by the executive order. It closed effectively on March 17th, and we shifted to emergency care. As of March 17th, we refunded all fees for Kids Club for the remainder of the year, and we shifted to what the governor had, which was a free program for essential workers, and then we expanded it to families in need. So we've been operating 5 sites, went down to 4 sites due to enrollment, but we have not received any revenue from March 17th through the end of May. We also canceled 930 enrichment programs and recreation classes. We refunded our preschool and ECFE fees for the remainder of the year. We did, as I shared last board meeting, continue with distance learning for our early childhood and our preschool families, and also for adult basic education. However, we knew that the distance learning, as we were developing it, just as the rest of the district over a course of a short period of time, we didn't know what that product would be, so we didn't feel it was appropriate to continue to charge the same fee without knowing what the product would be. We've had some great feedback from parents who have appreciated it, but it was a decision made on mid-March and early in this pandemic to refund those fees. We did also close all of our school buildings, so there were no rentals, no revenue from rentals. And then our other programs, such as our senior center, have been closed for the duration as well. In creating assumptions and creating this budget, we know that there's not going to be a change to our census count, and that's important because our state aid and levies are often based on the number of residents in our school district. We anticipate seeing an increase in the census once the 2020 census is complete, but that won't be on the books until the 2021-2022 school year. So we don't anticipate seeing an increase in any of those due to an increased population. We do anticipate continued state aid and levy. We've been told that the state will continue to provide, and I'll go over in the future what those aids are and the programs associated. We are seeing lower ratios and reduced offerings for summer. The governor has allowed us to begin offering outdoor recreation programming, so that'll begin next week. But we are running at the mandated by the Department of Health, the 9-to-1 ratio. Typically, those camps and clinics and programs might have a 20-to-1 ratio, and so we are much lower than we were, and we have fewer offerings because of the space availability and such. We are uncertain of what fall and winter will bring. When we started in March making some changes, the thinking at that time was, let's get through the end of the fiscal year and things will be looking better. But now here we are in June with still uncertainty of what the future will bring. So because of that, this budget assumes minimal revenue from fees for the fall and winter programming. I don't have a crystal ball, but at some point, the governor will continue to turn the dial on social distancing, and we're hoping that there will be an easing of some of the social distancing restrictions. And this budget assumes that will happen sometime around January of 2021. So the fees that were determined based on the January through June history of fees, and assuming very minimal fees now through December. And then this budget really, in my opinion, will be a fluid budget in that as we learn more, we'll make changes, we'll make adjustments. And so we'll be giving regular updates and making revisions to this budget throughout the year like we always do. but I anticipate that as we learn more, those changes will become more frequent as time goes on. When we look at our revenue, one large source of revenue you can see is local levy and state aid. You can see that there's about $4.5 million between the two. This comes through a number of formulas based on legislation. We get a general community education levy. We get money for youth development and after-school programming. Early childhood family education is a mix of both levy and aid. We get a small amount of money to provide programming for adults with disabilities. And then we receive money for extended day special services. So that's the cost related to provide school-age childcare for kids with disabilities beyond what the parent fee is. State aid comes in the form of early childhood, like I said. We also receive school readiness dollars, adult basic education. We receive money that's essentially a pass-through of the community service budget for non-public services. And then we offer preschool screening, and we're reimbursed based on the number of kids that we screen prior to enrollment in preschool. So those dollars are the basis of this budget, and they are money that we anticipate and have been told by the state that we will be getting for the upcoming fiscal year. We also looked at participation trends to help us make some assumptions on that budget. What we know now is that we've seen, now that we've been able to open up some, we've seen some trends in our summer program enrollments. Our school-age childcare program, although we offered emergency care at no cost for essential workers through the end of the school year, starting next week, that will be a fee-based program. However, there are a number of restrictions that have been put in place for safety. And so we are running at that 9-to-1 ratio, not the 15-to-1. And we did see a drastic reduction in enrollment. We've seen about 30% of what we would typically see in the summer. In fact, we had a number of families who had originally indicated that they needed and wanted childcare, but then when enrollment came 2 weeks later to re-enroll, they chose not to. And what we found out in talking with families is there are a variety of reasons. Some is that they don't feel safe sending their kids into the setting right now. Others, with a high unemployment rate, they have friends or family members who are able to watch their kids. And some, it's simply we have a 5-day-a-week program, and they've decided that that was more than they needed. So we've also started enrolling programs for our camps and clinics that are outdoors. We've seen about a 25% enrollment based compared to last June at this point. So we're seeing enrollments, which is promising that we know that families, and as a parent of 2 daughters who are high school age, they're looking for something to do. They want to get out. But we're also seeing the hesitation to jump right into it. And so those numbers are quite low. We do also know that we've developed some online options, both with our youth and adult programming. A lot of what we did early on were classes that were already planned and had enrollments in place that we simply moved to an online format. As we look ahead to fall and beyond, we are actually developing specific classes online so that we're ready for those if we indeed cannot meet in person. And then the last thing, and I shared a little bit about this last time, we started developing activity kits. We heard from the community that many parents, while they appreciate the ability to do distance learning with the technology that we have, they want something non-tech related for their kids. And so we've started putting together both recreation and enrichment activity kits that parents can pay a small fee for. We assemble them at Community Ed, and then we have pickup points throughout the community, and then we'll also mail them if needed. And so those are that's an example of a creative way that our staff saw a need, heard from the community, and I've started to develop something to meet that need. So we know that we can continue to develop programming and opportunities, but we also know that the uncertainty of what the fall will bring and what we've seen with summer are fees for the near future and into the first half of the fiscal year are likely to be quite low compared to past years. So when we looked at how do we project fees, because we are primarily a fee-based program, and what we did is we looked at a 4-year history of that second half of the year, quarters 3 and 4, that January through June, and we looked at what the enrollment trends were in each program area over the course of those 4 years to determine an appropriate assumption of what that spring enrollment could be. With a lot of these programs, our associated expenses are directly correlated to what we offer, and so we were able to make adjustments in those expenses based on, again, that 4-year trend. So for instance, if we offer a sports camp and the primary cost related to that sports camp is the coach and the secondary cost for that sports camp is equipment, or supplies, and we don't offer that camp, or we offer half as many camps, we're able to cut both that instructional cost and the supply cost or the equipment cost in half as well. So those are the adjustments that were made as we assumed or determined what our potential revenue would be. Obviously, as we get closer to January, if that's not the case, if we have either flattened the curve to a point where we're not social distancing anymore and we're back in larger groups, we can make that shift and offer more. And if we have seen an extension of stay at home or safer at home orders, we can continue to offer programming in a modified way. So this is just a look at where our revenue comes from. As like I said, we're primarily a fee-based program. This budget assumes 58% of the revenue coming from fees. That's both from our school-age childcare program and our enrichment and recreation programming. And then the bulk of the remainder of the revenue is going to come in the form of levy and aids. If this slide in previous years, in a typical year, would be about 78 or 80% fees. So you can see that reduction in anticipated fees does impact, and that's why our budget is 30% lower. And then that other, it says 0%, but it's just a very small amount, are things like fundraising dollars, maybe some grants, and then also we receive a little bit of money for our adult basic education program from federal sources. And so that's what that other is. Where does our money go? You can see that there are a number of areas, but the largest as a service-based industry is with salaries, wages, and benefits. And so over 85%, 87% of our expenses are personnel and staff related. And so while we can adjust some of those based on changes in programming, like I said, an instructor is contingent upon the class running. We also have a number of staff positions who are permanent positions that are support staff and coordinators and management and so forth. So that's what remains. And then we have services, supplies, and materials, and then some capital expenses. So as we look at this, like I said, this is really a bare bones budget. The presentation wasn't real exciting because there's not a lot of excitement happening right now. It's sort of a wait and see and do the best we can and make the best assumptions we can. Some of the things that we're looking ahead and have to be considering, one is we do offer financial assistance for our youth programming, youth and recreation and enrichment programming. That's based on free and reduced lunch criteria. We typically provide between $90,000 and $100,000 in assistance to kids and in programs without having a large fund balance, and with the cancellation of our largest fundraiser, which is the VIP, formerly the Daddy-Daughter Dance, which typically generates about $25,000, so about a quarter of that money, which we were not able to hold in the spring. We're going to have to look at, is that something we would need to cap or change our parameters? We still want to remain affordable. We want to serve the kids with highest need, but that's a reality that we're facing is if we can't do additional fundraising or come up with a way to offset some of the costs, we may have to change those parameters for this year or provide a cap. The other thing is in the spring, as you know, we made the decision to furlough paraprofessionals in community education because they were in programs that were fee-based, that were not generating revenue. At this point, this budget, because it is a balanced budget, doesn't have any specific plans to do that. But as we move forward, I just need to share with you as a board that if we come back in a couple of months or sometime over the course of the year and things have changed, that may be something, because 87% of our expenses are staff related, that we might have to make some of those tough decisions again, depending on what the future holds. And then also just kind of the last thing as we consider considerations ahead is I've got a really creative, hardworking group of people who work at Community Ed coming up with new ideas and new plans. And so I'm confident that this will help us generate some new types of programming that we can meet needs in the community. We still have our schoolie bus out and about in birthday parties and school parades, and we hope to use it as a food distribution tool after Nutrition Services is done with their food distribution and delivery at the end of June. So we're working with Washco Cares and Cheryl Jogger to come up with a plan to support those efforts. We have a number of community partners who have been involved with our summer schoolie program in the past who are anxious to work with us. It's just a matter of waiting to see what is possible. And from a social distancing and restriction standpoint, that we don't want to create crowds where we go, but we want to be able to serve needs. So those are some of the considerations that we have. And this budget, like I said, will continue to develop as time goes on. But at this point, the budget that's being proposed and that will come back to you in 2 weeks is in front of you. So $10.6 million in revenue, $10.5 million in expenses, with just shy of $100,000 in a positive net result. So now I would take any questions or comments.
Hey, Bob, this is Simi. I had a couple questions. You had mentioned, or in your presentation, you mentioned that we get levy money for after-school programming. Is that money dependent on us being back in school on a traditional schedule?
So, so we get a couple of sources of revenue for after school or out of school time. We get one, it's an after school youth enrichment levy, and that is not contingent upon us being back in school. That is based on the number of the population or the census of our community. And so we can use those dollars to support enrichment activities, even if school's not in session. The second source of levy that we receive is our disabilities for our school-age childcare. So that is directly related to costs incurred to provide programming for kids with disabilities beyond the parent fees. And so that every year is based on the previous year's actual cost. So next year, it won't affect us because it's based on this year's numbers. 2 years from now, if next year is low, we could see a little bit of a slip in those dollars. But so the answer is no, it's not contingent upon us being back in school. But if we're not back in school and we don't offer a fee-based childcare program, we may lose some of the extended day disabilities dollars.
And your budget, does this budget also include stuff like credit recovery, so the program, those dollars as well?
Not credit recovery. Credit recovery is in the general fund. And so that is separate. It gets a little confusing because Susie Evans oversees both credit recovery and adult basic ed. But this does include adult basic ed like English language learning and basic skills and GED and the diploma programs. So those dollars are all based on student, or not all, there's quite a complicated formula. It's based on both census count and also student contact hours. And those are, again, based on the previous year. And so we, and when the pandemic started in March, the state cut off the reporting date as of, I think it was March 17th or 16th, and they're readjusting everything from prior to that. So all of the contact hours from then until now have not been included. That's because not every district, like we were able to, has been able to provide distance learning. But yes, we will receive dollars for adult basic education next year based on this year's student contact.
And then one other question I had was, you had mentioned that you're seeing a decline in the number of, a year-over-year decline in the number of students who are registering for summer care. Have you surveyed for Kids Club? I'm thinking in particular in the fall. Have you surveyed parents who have traditionally used Kids Club to find out what they would need to see in order to feel comfortable sending their children back for after school? And if so, what have they said?
Yeah, so we've seen a decline, not year over year. Well, maybe this is what you're saying. We saw a decline this year, a significant decline this year versus last year. So we've typically seen a pretty consistent summer enrollment number. And so we did try to get some feedback from parents on what they were looking for. And when we do have a comprehensive safety plan that we've implemented in emergency childcare that we're going to be using for summer. And as soon as we shared that, also when we started seeing enrollments. So I don't have specific information on what parents were looking for. I can get that. I can talk to our team and find out what survey information they received. Our survey was primarily, do you need care and would you use it if we offered it? And we saw a much larger number say yes than actually showed up with registration. So I can tell you as well, with our summer camps and clinics, they've been open for quite some time. And as soon as we published our safety protocol is when we started seeing those enrollments really come in. So I know a lot of parents it seems from those two instances, are waiting to see what safety protocol will be in place before they make that final decision. So.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions for Bob? Okay, and then a reminder, this will come before us on our June 18th meeting for a vote. Thank you, Bob. Okay, and item 8.2 is our preliminary budget for the 2021, or for 2021, presented by Dan Pye, Director of Finance and Operations.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for our time tonight. We will be going over the preliminary budget for next year, and we'll just get right into it. Okay. So our agenda for this presentation, at first we're going to talk about some budget notes and terms. Just want everybody to have a rudimentary knowledge of what we're talking about in some of these budget terms. We'll talk about where the money comes from, what's the money spent on, some of the significant increases in this budget, the district challenges we're going to be facing, and then, of course, the schedule for the budget, because a lot of our financial stuff is on a pretty tight timeline. About the budget, I just like to tell people this so that they all understand the budget's not a gospel. It's not gospel. It's a guide. It keeps us on track to remain solvent. It's somewhat flexible. We do revise it once a year. The budget's great at taking blame. Someone doesn't get what they want, they can just blame the budget. Our budget is very large. We're a very large district right now, and this has gone down over the years, but it's about 17,500 lines long. And if we spend 1 minute developing each line, it would take us about 304 hours to compile the budget, or just 7 weeks of doing nothing else but budget. Fortunately, we have 4 people working on it. It does take a lot. Some of the, and I wish we would have had these numbers out sooner, but it takes a lot of time to compile these things. And as we wait for the staffing to come through, that's the main the cost of everything. I know it's wrong going in. Many things are speculated, including the revenue, and we'll talk about that. But it's the best guess we have, the best estimate we have right now with the information we have. And we still work on a zero-based budget. We calculate salary expenses for each employee. That means that we basically build the budget from the ground up based on the fact that every expense we account for. We really have to do this method at this point because our fund balance is at such a risky level that we want to make sure we don't miss anything. Some of the terms are run into, just the main one is the unassigned balance. So when we talk about our fund balance tonight, basically the big discussion is our unassigned balance. Unassigned funds are used for operations, including instruction, instructional support, transportation, maintenance, activities, and district administration. When we talk about the percentage, it's the balance of the unassigned amount divided by the expenditures on unassigned funds. The board goal is 5 to 9%. And this does not include funds that are reserved by statute or rule. Those funds that are reserved by statute or rule are your school nutrition, your community services, your debt service, your building construction. They have their own separate funds, OPEB funds. But within the general fund, we have long-term facility maintenance funds that can only be, the revenue can only be spent on that, operating capital and capital projects levy. We have safe schools, we have student activity accounts, and staff development queue accounts. That's just a few of them, but really when we spend money in those accounts, it's not going to affect what the balance is in the unassigned fund balance. So if we reduce spending in those funds, it will not affect the unassigned fund balance. If we increase spending in those funds, it will not affect the unassigned fund balance. Spending in those funds is limited by the targeted revenues of those. Just a couple of notes. We want to make sure we get this in there so that everybody's aware about tuition agreements. We don't have any agreements with other school districts for next year. The special education students who go elsewhere are billed through a state process in which dollars owed are subtracted from special education aid. Those students from other districts who attend our district, we create tuition All that is figured out by the Minnesota Department of Education. They just give us the numbers. We don't do actual billing for those. But the students living outside the state, the tuition for our district for secondary is $11,391, and for elementary is $9,509, because anyone that's living outside of the state is not funded by the state, so we are required to charge tuition. And then just a note that you may recall, the TRA pension bill was passed in 2018 for 5 years. The contribution rate will go up by 0.21%. For at least these 5 years, that increase has been covered by state aid, extra state. And GASB 84 has caused us to put all the student activity accounts under board control in the general fund now. So we're running all those to the general fund. That actually increased our revenues in the general fund and expenses by about $1 million. And there's a little more restrictions on what can be done with those. Where's the money come from? What at this point, Minnesota school districts are funded by a combination of state aid, local levies, federal aid, and fees. 72% of our revenue in the general fund comes from state aid. Where does the state get the money? They get their money from the income taxes and sales tax. Why is that important to me? Because as the economy goes, state collections go in the areas of income tax and sales. Local levies are property taxes, of which most all the property taxes we collect were voted on by the taxpayers, by the voters, and were approved. Most of it is operating referendum in the general fund. Federal aid is derived from federal income taxes. We do not get a lot of money there relative to the size of our district, mainly based on our free and reduced counts and our situations. We get about $4.5 million from federal aid. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a little bit. And then of course the rest is fees. And obviously with the cancellation of all the activities this spring, we saw a reduction in this year's fees. We're budgeting based on having a normal school year next year. That's about $4.5 million. Just simply so everybody knows, I tell you this probably 15 times a year, well, maybe 10 times a year. How do we get our state aid? There's a basic formula set by the state legislature. Next year is $6,567 per adjusted pupil unit. That's an increase of 2%. That was put into law the session before this one, last year's session. The largest portion of our aid is just calculated fairly simply by multiplying the enrollment, they call them pupil units, by the basic formula. We receive about $135 million through this formula. We also receive an additional probably $4,000 per student from some of these other aids, as I've listed. I won't go through each of those. And we also, well, we receive about $2,000 from those aids, and we receive $2,260 from our operating reference per student. So as I said, in simple forms, that where we get most of our aid is by multiplying our pupil count or pupil units by the basic formula plus some other formulatory things, about $10,500 a year. So to me, enrollment is very important. And this year, we budgeted an enrollment of 18,926. So far, as we look at next year's enrollment, what's on the books right now, that's higher than that, than what I've budgeted. And also, if I use my projection model, which is sitting in front of you, I'm using, that projects that we'd have 18,995 students, which is also higher than what the budget is. So general rule of thumb is, to budget conservatively. So the budget of 18,926 students, I feel is going to be a good number, and we could get more revenue than we're thinking we're going to. The other thing to note would be that this shows about a 1.26% increase in enrollment. We're expecting enrollment to grow a little bit over 1% a year for the next 3 years, and that doesn't include housing starts. And of course, the houses seem to be still going up even through this economic calamity. But we'll see. We'll see. But budget side, I keep it lower if I can. Other big revenues we get, special education. We're estimated about $30,170,000. It's the highest it's ever been. Obviously, the more you spend, the more the aid will go up. It's driven by cost. New formulas have been put into place, but they're meant to be hold harmless, so they'll figure out how much you would have made in the old formula compared to how much you made in the new formula and give you the higher amount. This amount also includes cross-subsidy reduction aid, which was the new aid that was given out 2 years ago, and it's maxed out now. It's about $600 per pupil unit. Now, the thing about aid, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but the thing I want to remember about special education aid is that it runs a year behind. So as we see a big increase in our special ed costs, you can't add the aid immediately. You're going to basically have to wait a year. So if you have a bigger size increase, it creates a bigger lag. What's the cross subsidy? Well, it's the difference between a district's special education costs and the amount of aid it receives. It's meant to represent the amount the general fund must fund to make up the difference. Federal government has promised in the IDEA Act to fund 40% of that cost. That level has never risen above 16%. When the last time I went to DC to lobby for our national organization, and I called up our Melcher Tom Melcher real quick to find out, what would happen if they actually funded the right amount. It would have been about another $5 million for our district. I don't know if they ever get to that 40%. It's a promise that's never been held, but it's also something we should hold their feet to the fire on. Our cross subsidy in 2021 will be about $16 million. And then the other big revenue I mentioned a little bit before is operating referendum and local optional revenue that's approved by the district voters, and that's $2,260 per pupil, District 830. So as we look at the budget summary, it is what it is. It's a conservative budget. I'll explain why, or the reasons I feel why when we look at it, why we're showing a deficit, but basically we're showing revenues of about $259 million. That's a 3.4% increase. But unfortunately, our expenses are rising about 5%. And actually, I think the numbers might have moved a little bit, but the deficit is still the same. We have a deficit of about $6.8 million. We see most of the increase in our salaries and benefits, some in the services. The service increase is mainly long-term facility maintenance dollars, which come out of restricted funds. These numbers here include all the funds, the restricted funds and the services will not really harm the unassigned fund. So as we look at it, the expenses are increasing by about 5%. While revenues are increasing by only 3.4%. This gap is causing a reduction in the fund balance. Salaries and benefits are increasing 6 and 4.8% respectively. Additional staff that we've added from this budget, about 4.4 in licensed instructional. And I say licensed instructional, that it does include counselors. We did have reduction in the new middle school schedule, but then we backfilled with some counselors. And then in special education, we're looking at adding 32.8 FTEs in licensed teachers and 33.16 FTEs in paraprofessionals. So special education costs are increasing about $4.8 million, or about 10%. That does contribute a lot to the increase in our expenses. And as I said before, because of the funding system, these costs will not hit revenue until about 2022. This is just a illustration of the difference between the special education revenues and the expenditures over the last 5 years. And you can see the gap is rising at the cross subsidy reduction age will go up as we have a larger cross subsidy, so that the revenue should come up a little better next year. But like I said, we kind of have a gap right now. We should be seeing our special ed revenue rise faster next year. And if we can keep our expenses somewhat flat, we should see some of our fund balance squeeze back together a little bit. And to note, and when we looked at I looked at the unduplicated child count for special education. It's risen about 700 students in the last 5 years. So I mean, it's obvious, why the expenses. And that's just the unduplicated. That doesn't really take into account, if a student receives more than one service, and it also doesn't take into account, the services that are provided, depending on which disability code they might fall under. So as a recap, we have about a $6.8 million difference between our revenues and our expenses. This will result in a reduction of the general fund balance of about $6 million and a reduction of our unassigned general fund balance of about $5 million. We will be making some transfers from some of our restricted accounts that are allowed in this pandemic governor's directives. We need to pay school nutrition for COVID-19 costs that were not allowed by federal rules. And that will raise school nutrition's fund balance higher than we anticipated. Then we'll also look at the costs that were incurred by community services and transfer some money there. Those transfers will not affect our unassigned fund balance. They will affect our total fund balance. Just an illustration of the history that you can look at when you get a chance of our general fund. The blue is the revenues, and the orange is the expenditures over the years. And when we look at that deficit of $6.8 million, it's obviously something that's really distressed all of us. But in relative terms, it's about 2.6% of our revenue. If we can squeeze a percent out of expenses and squeeze maybe another 0.5% out of revenues next year, because I was being conservative, I mean, it should lower the gap, I would hope. And then we'll have more time now this year to plan ahead, because we're looking at some rocky roads ahead. Another illustration of where a dollar goes, and in general, you see this every time, I guess, so you're kind of used to it. But in general, we spend about 48% of our expenditures on regular instruction and another 19% on special ed, and 5% on instructional support. So about 72% of our expenditures are directly into the classroom. And then we spend another 10% on pupil support, which includes social workers, counselors, and transportation. And then about 12% on our maintenance staff to maintain the building. So 72% is in the classroom, another 22% is getting kids to school, helping out kids, and making sure the buildings are there and clean and functional. And then we spend about 3% on administration, or 3.6, and about 3.6% on district support. So as we look at what are going to be our projections, this chart shows you the history. This is now, once again, this is the unassigned fund balance. We're projecting at the end of 2020 right now that we have about a 3.7% unassigned fund balance. It's a drop from what we ended up at 4.3% last year. That might come in a little better just because we're still being conservative. We lost a lot of revenues, but we also were able to, have some less expenses in utilities and supplies and things like that, and transportation costs. But we're still seeing a drop. And then mainly because of the way we ended up with our school year as far as collecting fees and such. But then next year we're looking at a drop to about 1.28% of our unassigned fund balance. And we know that's well below what we want to be. That's why we'll probably have to, we will have to look in the future at making some kind of budget decisions and budget reductions. And as we look at what's influencing future fund balances, we know the fund balance is in a precarious position. The next legislative session is a funding year. However, because of the economy, we should not be expecting any increase in the formula. So as your revenue doesn't increase at all, except for maybe some enrollment increases, it's very hard to have your expenses go up by their normal cost of living expenses, even as little as 2%. That could translate pretty quickly into a lower fund balance. So as I look ahead, I think we will require about $10 million in reductions in the 21-22 budgets. And I think we need to do another $10 million in reductions in the 22-23 budget. About 4% of the budget each year. Some factors, instructional delivery, meaning that if distance learning continues or we have many more students that may go on to some kind of online features instead, and we can offer that those things can all affect the budget and probably in a positive way. Enrollment, increases in enrollment that we don't budget, they can buffer reductions. Obviously, the more students you have, you multiply by the formula, you're going to have more state aid. Special education funding, of course, as you know, there's a lag there. That money should come in. I don't anticipate they'll have any money to increase it legislatively. But as we look at the cross subsidy, and then there's just the other factors like what utilities and maintenance costs are going to be and unfunded mandates, and then negotiating contracts. The other funds, now these number will be a little different than Bob's because I anticipated transferring some money as allowed by the governor's directive. And then also in the school nutrition fund, I was going to have to transfer money to pay for some of those expenses that the school nutrition fund cannot pay for. So we're looking at about $450,000 or $700,000, then about $450,000 into 21 in school nutrition, about $326,000 community education. And the building construction is a flow-through account. That money in there is mainly for long-term facility maintenance projects. What's next? Well, we'll approve the preliminary 2021 budget at the next meeting. We are still looking at the budget. See if we can find any other loopholes, but anything that may have been missed or that could be better than we thought. So if I bring it back to you, obviously I'll give you, when I bring you back to get approved, you're going to get real solid numbers. Numbers you have to approve, but if they change it all, I'll announce it when I ask. This is what we changed last week. Our friends, the auditors, actually arrive next week. And then they come back in the fall. That's important because once we get the audited fund balance, then we can insert that into our future projections and see if it came in better than anticipated. We're going to start a budget reduction process in the fall. I don't have any other details about that. We're working on that in conjunction with all the cabinet members. Then we'll have tax levies that are approved in September and December. We'll have truth on taxation hearing. We will have audits that are presented to the board in either November or December. We can put those numbers into the 2021 revised budget. We can see what our fund balances look like, and then we can revise the 2021 budget. We prepare the 21-22 budget after we go through any kind of budget adjustment process. That's it for my numbers presentation. Once again, and I didn't change your title on there. I'm sorry, Chris. But I want to just thank all the many people that help us put this budget together. Like I said, it's a lot of lines and a lot of input from different people, starting out with Chris Blackburn, who does the bulk of the numbers. And I try not to bug her too much about where's my numbers, but she's getting used to it. The finance staff, that all chip in every day. The school nutrition staff that put together the budget, Wendy Peterson that presented last week. Community service staff, Bob, once again, did an outstanding job on his budget. And I'll be happy to know that we'll transfer some money in. Human resources, Kevin Witherspoon, and the staffing specialists, which work very closely with Chris. Payroll department that puts together all the numbers. And then, of course, the assistant soups, the principals and directors all help out a lot. And the communication. Excuse me. It is a very big task to put this together. It's almost a bigger task than doing the audit, just because the audit's more plug and play and just trying to balance numbers, where the budget is, there's a lot more human involved transactions. With that, I'd be glad to take any questions. And this is just for present information tonight, and I would bring it back to you next time.
Hey, Dan, this is Simi. I had a couple questions. When was the last time our budget or our general fund was within school board guidelines for funding?
Oh, the unassigned fund balance?
Yeah.
Well, I believe it was, I'd have to look at it. I think it might have been 2014. I know 2013 for sure. 2014 is when Chris and I first came in, but well, we did have a big transfer there. 2014 probably.
And so, like I see in 2016, we had a fund balance of 1.2, which is what you're projecting it to be after next school year. And then it took us about 3 years to get up to 4.3, which is as close to 5% as we've been lately. What happened over that period of time? Is that just levies passing? Or is there more to it that got our general fund in a better financial place?
Yeah, mainly when we got up to the 4.3, if that's what you're asking, it was the culmination of all the final levies passed, when we first started looking at this, and when I got here in 2014, we looked at the projections right away, and I told the superintendent and the cabinet and the board that, based on how it's going, we're not going to be able to sustain this. We're gonna have to look at, either more revenue or something. We went through a budget reduction process in 2014. We were looking to reduce about $8 million, and we reduced about $4 million. And then when we looked at what else, we would do, well, then we looked at the revenue, and the board asked, how much do you need? So we, figured it all out, and I said, well, we need about $900 more per pupil. But knowing, in concern for the taxpayers, we split that into two different levies. So finally, when we got to that last levy, and that got us to the 900, and that got us close to our fund balance. Frankly, what's happening now is a lot of it has to do with some of the programs. Some of the programs are costing more than, they're going up faster than the revenue goes up. A 2% fund increase does not even cover all of our revenue. And if the special education costs are going to rise by the amounts that they've risen over the last 4 years, it just doesn't sustain it.
And Simi, but I'm trying to think of 2010 or so, we had a 9 as Eastridge opened, and we had certain costs. We had a higher fund balance. We were within our policy quite a bit. When I came in 2012, that first year, 8 years ago, we were cutting $4 million that year. So we were already on that trajectory down as we kept programs, and the funding wasn't there. We didn't have the same levies. And so we've been reducing for the last decade, really. And then I think too, there was a little bit of help from the state with some of the funding that they've been trying to look at, but a lot of it had to do, as Dan said, and as you pointed out, the levies. But now that this year we had anticipated with the growth of housing in the long-term facility that we were going to make it back in there, and then the closure came and everything changed. Kind of pushed us back quite a few years.
So, you had mentioned that, there's going to need to be adjustments of $10 million over the next couple years. I'm trying to see the slide again. But $10 million both next year and the year after, correct?
That's what I recommend, yes.
And, and not next year, next school year, I mean, next year, 21, 22. Will that $20 million in reductions, do you think that would get us back within our fund balance?
It'll be very hard to tell, only because, I'm saying that only because if I don't see any revenue increase percent-wise, and we just have our normal, say our expenses increase 2%, that's $5.2 million without any corresponding increase in revenue. So you're fighting. So if you reduce 10, you're going to save 5. So two years of that is going to get you $10 million, saving 5 each year if we have no increase in the formula. So the 10 million is going to get us up to about 12 million. Yeah, that would be close. I'd have to do the calculation real quick, but then around 12, 13 million will get us to around 5.
Any other questions for Dan? Okay, no other questions. We will hear from Dan again at our next board meeting. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next item on the agenda is 9.0, discussion items, and we don't have any tonight. So then we'll go into 10.0, action items, and we do have a few of those tonight. 10.1 is approval of proposed changes to the 400 series of policies presented by Mike Johnson, our Assistant Superintendent, for 3 more weeks.
Good evening, Vice Chair Schwartz, board members, Dr. Jacobus, and fellow cabinet members. This evening, we have some 400 level policies that we put forth for approval for tonight after a first reading on May 21st. Some we simply placed up for review and have no recommended changes to them. However, another group of 400 levels have been reviewed and revised to reflect updates in statute, definitions, legal references, and cross-references. Our 3 board policy committee members reviewed the policies and made recommendations for board information and subsequent action. Furthermore, specific directors and principals provided input on select policies. Current policies are always located online. 14 policies in the 400 level series were selected for review with no editing or revisions after I examined them along MSBA models. However, the suggested changes are listed below on your cover sheet for the 6 400 level policies, and tonight administration seeks your approval for the edits on those 6. Thank you.
We did see these at our last board meeting, but does anybody have any questions? Okay, seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the proposed changes to the 400 series of policies.
Sharon Van Leer, so moved.
Pat Driscoll, second.
Okay, and a roll call, please, Dana.
Melinda Doles,
Yes.
Louise Hines,
Yes.
Simi Petnaik,
Yes.
Pat Driscoll,
Yes.
Sharon Van Leer,
Yes.
Katie Schwartz.
Yes. Motion passes. The next item is 10.2, approval of resolution authorizing Northeast Metro 916 long-term facility maintenance plan presented by Dan Pine, Director of Finance and Operations. Dan, you're muted.
Probably better that way. So hello again. This item isn't real isn't super complicated. Every year, intermediate districts like 916, of which we belong to, Northeast Metro, are eligible for long-term facility maintenance revenue through the long-term facility maintenance process administered by the Minnesota Department of Education. They're asking for a LTFM levy of $173,600. Every district pays a portion of that, or pays a portion, but they also levy a portion of that. It has to go to each school board to be approved because it's a levy that's going straight into our levy process and paid for by the taxpayers. We don't know what our portion is. Generally, we're about double the size of the next highest district in there, so we usually pay about half of the cost of everything. So well, not half, we pay about 30%. So our levy is probably going to be somewhere, they said it's going to be somewhere around $17,000. But I recommend that you do approve the resolution mainly so that they can collect these LTFM funds and improve and keep their buildings safe. And then students from our district attend those attend school in those buildings, and that they'll be subject to health and safety conditions that are corrected and improved. So I just asked, it's a resolution, so I'd ask you to pass the resolution, and then we can send that on into 960.
Does anybody have any questions for Dan on this one? Dana, do I have to read the resolution approving part?
You can summarize it.
Okay. So let's see here. We'll summarize what I got here. This is a resolution approving Northeast Metropolitan Intermediate School District number 916 long-term facility maintenance budget and authorizing the inclusion of a proportionate share of those projects in the district's application for long-term facility maintenance revenue. And I would entertain a motion to approve the resolution.
Karen Van Leer, Karen Van Leer, second.
I'm sorry, who made the first?
Pat.
Thank you.
And roll call, Dana?
Melinda Doles?
Yes.
Louise Hines?
Yes.
Simi Pitnaik?
Yes.
Pat Driscoll?
Yes.
Sharon Van Leer?
Yes.
Katie Schwartz?
Yes. Okay, motion passes. On to 10.3, approval of nutrition services budget presented by Dan Pyan, Director of Finance and Operations. Welcome back, Dan.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, the last board meeting, you heard the presentation from Wendy Peterson on their budget and the challenges they faced and what we look for next year. Now, this budget is predicated on actually having school in its normal way. Things could change if, we need to feed everybody in the classrooms, or if we need to, if we can't utilize our normal cafeteria style lunches. But as it is now, based on the way the numbers look, we are proposing to increase our lunch and breakfast prices by 10 cents each. That still leaves us, we believe, in the middle of the pack amongst our comparable districts. The budget that was presented in the packet, the revenues and the expenditures are what we're asking to be approved. The fund balance will be a little different next week when we submit the whole budget in, because we are going to transfer some money to make up for some costs that they could not use school nutrition funds to pay during the pandemic crisis. And the reason we wanted to bring it to the board as a separate item tonight was because we do realize that there's an increase in the prices, and we wanted to make sure that was pointed out.
Anyone have any questions for Dan? Or it looks like Wendy's on too for the nutrition service budget. Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to approve the nutrition service budget.
Louise Hines, so moved.
Melinda, second.
And Dana, roll call, please.
Melinda Doles,
Yes.
Louise Hines,
Yes.
Simi Petniak,
Yes.
Pat Driscoll,
Yes.
Sharon Van Leer,
Yes.
Katie Schwartz.
Yes. Motion passes. Thank you again, Dan.
Thank you.
Okay. And now we are moving on to 11.0 reports and comments. 11.1 superintendent's report.
Thanks. I'll try to summarize that a little bit more here, but in interest of time, I know that it is challenging as we do these remote meetings and things that may not seem as long, I know seem longer online. So just want to summarize the last week of school. So we finished with new learning with elementary kids last week, and then this week teachers were working on connecting with their students' parents and doing a report on their literacy and math progress, letting them know the successes, where they are, and giving them some suggestions on throughout the summer for potential enrichment and where they see kids coming into school next fall. I hope that those individual meetings will help alleviate some of the concerns parents had about, as Simi mentioned earlier, the amount of time that we lost and did we increase gaps or will we be way behind? I'm sure I haven't heard the reports yet, but I'm sure they're positive conversations and it's great to connect at the end. The secondary kids this week now, secondary students, as we finish new learning, now we are focused on the students that are struggling to complete the course successfully and looking at personalized interventions and working with students to make sure that by the end of the week we can bring them up to pass. As you know, next week we have our 4 high school virtual graduations. Just a reminder that the South Washington Alternative High School's graduation is Tuesday, June 9th at 3:30. East Ridge High School is next Friday, the 12th at 6. Woodbury High School is Saturday, June 13th at 6 p.m. And Park High School is Sunday, June 14th at 6 p.m. And then on the 27th of May, we had our Next Step graduation. So we had 24 students graduating from the Next Steps program, Next Step. It's always such a positive graduation and the students are so excited. It's wonderful to see them get ready to go out in the world. Quickly, planning for next fall, as we went through the themes and we mentioned that we begun that planning process based on the 3 options that MDE is looking at. And we have put together a process that's similar to our long-term facilities planning process, the most recent that you've seen, awaiting the final decision. But part of the process is, as we said, is to look at what worked well and enhance that, and then to look at flexibility as we go forward, and then to improve what did not work well with our kids. The planning framework consists of a strategy team, a planning teams, and community advisory team. The strategy team is comprised of central administrators and district leaders. This team will guide the work and make the final decision on the plan or plans. I mean, we'll look at plans, but the final plan that will come to you for approval once we know in the summer which plan the state is looking at. The planning teams will be comprised of subject area experts that will develop comprehensive written plans and procedures and protocols to implement in the 5 areas that you saw the themes come through from the focus groups: health and safety, mental health, and social and emotional well-being. We called it system logistics, which would be the scheduling and things like that if we have an alternative scheduling, teaching and learning practices, and adult learning and professional development. We are also including parents there that we need to, and we know we need to, look at how do we support our parents if we are in, say, the distance learning or even the online learning as we go forward. Then the community advisory team will be made up of parents, community members, board members, and that team will provide input to the strategy team on the decisions of the procedures and protocols that are developed by the planning team. So all of this we started already, and we will be meeting on a regular basis week after week which isn't, it sounds like that's a long time, but we will have this completed by the end of July in concert, hopefully, with the announcement of what fall will look like. Then in August, we'll look at finalizing for that plan any logistics that will look at, like transportation. So that's it.
Any questions, comments for Keith? Okay, then we'll move on to 11.2, our school board member reports. Melinda Doles.
Yeah, hi. So I've just really been enjoying taking part in different virtual things that are going on through the district. I've been really impressed with how well they've been done. I've taken part in a couple of virtual award ceremonies, and I also attended the live virtual next step commencement that Keith was just referring to. And I just think that administration and Nikki and all the staff at Next Step did a phenomenal job with setting that up. There were so many personal touches involved in it. It was really nice to be a part of that. I've also been taking part in a few of those reverse parades at some of the schools. So those have been really enjoyable as well.
Thank you, Melinda. Pat Driscoll.
I have no report.
Thank you. Louise Hines.
It's been a virtual time for me as well. I certainly appreciate there were several group calls set up by the Minnesota School Board Association that I got to take part in, and I know some other of the board members were there too. One talking with Education Commissioner Ricker. There was one on graduation ceremonies and what people are doing in different parts, and the most recent one last week on lessons learned with distance learning. I also had an opportunity to see East Ridge High School's academic awards ceremony. That was good. One thing too that I thought was phenomenal and moved from a live event to a virtual event. There's been a tradition with fifth graders to do track and field events at year end, a north and a south. And the physical education staff and all the schools collaborated so that this could be done virtually with kindergarten through fifth grade. And they had an extended period of time, but each one of the schools contributed an event. And then each event was run for 1 minute with the idea that you can do this and then you can improve on it. It was really, really well done if you get a chance to watch. I know they sent a video around of some of the students participating, which was great. And I had an opportunity, again, another tradition, typically in the elementary schools, when the buses leave for the last time, the staff goes out and waves on the street. And so I did get a chance to go to Royal Oaks, and they did another reverse parade. So instead of the buses driving through, the children came with their parents driving them through, and everybody had that continuity of saying goodbye, or that opportunity for some closure.
Thank you, Louise. Simi Penny.
Yeah, like Louise and Melinda, I got to attend a couple parades. I attended the parade at Nuevas Fronteras and the parade at Newport. The Newport parade in particular was very fun because a lot of the teachers were mentioning that they had taught the parents of the students. And so, you know, you could see your fifth grader from 30 years ago driving the car with your current fifth grader. And it was just really fun to see how connected those students were with their teachers and how fun it was. My job at the parades is to take bad pictures. And so that's what I do. And I got to talk to a lot of the staff at both schools about how distance teaching has gone for them and some of the things they wish we knew and some of the challenges that they had. And, you know, they both mentioned how hard they've been working to deliver the content, but that the content isn't necessarily the same level of content that they would like to teach. And some of the challenges, you know, speaking or teaching Spanish when, for example, nobody in the household speaks Spanish other than the kindergartner or first grader. And both Hillside and Newport mentioned challenges with English language learners and how hard it was to stay connected with those families virtually. And then I also got to talk with Susie Evans about how the Access program is doing and how she was mentioning that distance learning has really opened up a lot of opportunities for them. because it has taken away some of the challenges they've had previously with things like childcare or transportation. They've been able to bring in, whole families can be present for the adult learning that's taking place. And they've got a new national parent group that's starting up this summer. And then they're also doing credit recovery for 9th through 11th graders, kind of a 2-week, highly flexible program to help students, some of the students who struggled with distance learning, help them get back on their feet for starting school this September.
Thank you. And Sharon Van Leer.
Pass.
Okay. And I just want to say congratulations to all of our graduating seniors and good luck in your future endeavors. And that is that. And 12.0 is our future meeting dates. 12.1 is Thursday, June 18th, 2020. School board meeting at 6:30. And we're on to 12.2, Thursday, July 16th of 2020. School board meeting at 6:30. 13.0 is adjournment.